What happened the time you saw the rage of a patient man? Story number 1. I used to go to a pub with a few of my friends in my hometown. It was a small establishment in the town centre, a traditional English pun complete with an attractive bar stocked with regulars like us. Every time we were there, a guy would be sitting at the bar by himself with a half bit of resentment. He had occasionally joined in on the banter, but he was never loud or intoxicated. He was a nice guy who always said hello and smiled. We knew him only as Ray, and he was about 60 years old. He was a normal-looking guy with a few forearm tattoos. As is customary in the north of England in the 1990s, on a Saturday afternoon, my 4 friends and I were enjoying our usual few drinks because there was a football game on. 3 away fans bravely entered the pub, but everyone looked at them suspiciously. But they continued to drink. They went to the bar and immediately began to be rude to the barmaid, making lewd remarks and loudly complaining about the beer, etc. Ray looks at these 3 men and says, "No need to be rude, boys, she's here to do a job." This sparked a barrage of verbal abuse from the away fans. "You're going to do something about it, etc., and the regulars aren't having any of this." Everyone, including me, gets up and looks at these idiots. Ray turns to everyone and says, "Sit down, guys. We'll deal with this." Then he turns to the away fans and says, "Come on." After a mere 20 seconds, Grandad leaves and the 3 men leave the bar. Ray returns without saying anything, sits back in his stool, and takes a swig of bitter curiosity. We all ran outside to witness the complete carnage, with 2 men dead. He was working in an auto parts warehouse, and one of our managers was a very calm and collected person. One day, some of the orders were incorrect, and the ordering system was not working properly, so he calmly went out back, started up a forklift, and rounded at full speed at a huge stack of wood pallets. He must have thrown it in reverse, and he repeated this about a dozen times, raising and lowering the forks appropriately. Everyone stopped working to watch his every last pallet was destroyed when there was nothing left. Story 3. I didn't see this, but my dad told me about his grandparents. His great-grandfather and grandmother were British, and they visited occasionally in the 1960s. I believe the great-grandfather fought in one of the wars during World War I and was captured by the Germans and held as a POW. He had been through some difficult times, and he was quiet and generally nice, but he couldn't hear much. His great-grandmother Sherry liked him and was constantly bugging and bothering him. While my great-grandmother was talking about something, my great-grandfather was sitting in his chair by the fire smoking his pipe. At that point, she grabbed one of those fire pokers and threw it at him. His hands were resting on the chair's arms, and the poker got wedged in between his fingers, but it didn't hit him. My great-grandfather, unfazed, got up, took the poker out, put it back in its place, and sat down again, saying, "You won't be doing that again, will we?" Story 4. My grandfather is a saint. My grandmother had 99 deadly blood cancer in her late 60s. They went to the Cleveland Clinic as a last resort. Neither of them was religious, but that night they prayed, and he vowed to live his life as the best Christian possible if my grandmother was cured. 2 weeks later, while still awaiting treatment options, there was no blood cancer detectable anymore, so he's that kind of good Christian man. My aunt was 12 years old when she and the neighbor boy were making out on the couch. According to her, there was no hanky-panky, and the neighbor boy's mother came over to accuse me. Want of being on to open the door, and the woman called her a well. My grandma was in the kitchen and ran away, pushed the woman off the front porch and into the front yard, and began beating on her. This isn't crazy. My grandma was furious. The neighbor's husband came over to break it up and pull her off. Then he retreated as if he was going to hit her. At this point, my grandpa came onto the porch and said, "Buds, if you hit my wife, I'll kill your whole damn family." Everyone I've spoken to about the incident claims that the calmness in his voice is what made them shudder, and I've even discussed it with the elderly buzzard, and he tells it just like everyone else. My dad said he had no doubt at all that my grandfather would have done it, and he has never said anything or done it. Story 5. One of my teachers was the kindest, most patient man who would work with you until you got something, even if it meant missing lunch. There was this mouthy little girl who kept messing around in his class, and he always kept us cool, even when she was being really rude. I don't know how she didn't get expelled though, because he always kept us cool. She ignored this kid's warning to stop because we were tampering with the chemicals and there was a risk of contamination. After months of him giving her, he slowly approached her desk, took her Coke, poured it over her head, and walked back to the front of the class to continue teaching. To our protests, he was fired. Story 6. My brother-in-law is a very quiet guy who kind of keeps to himself. He's also big and built like Bam Bam Bigelow, for all you fans of 80s wrestling, and has tattoos all over his head, neck and body. Imagine that he is a pretty intimidating guy, which is why his quiet voice and laid-back manner can be so unexpected. We are watching a movie in a theater when the kids behind us start acting out, throwing popcorn, and generally making a ruckus. My brother-in-law gets up, turns around, and tells them to stop because they are disturbing everyone else. They behave for about 15 minutes, but then they start acting out again. He gets up without saying anything, grabs the lead instigator by the throat, lifts him out of his chair, pulls him in close, growls, shuts the up, and gently puts him back down for the remainder of the movie. When I was in high school, an upperclassman at my all-male Catholic school followed a female teacher into the bathroom and attempted to rape her. She screamed at first, but he then attempted to rape her with a knife. The kindest, most compassionate Latin teacher heard the scream and hurried from his classroom straight into the woman's restroom, slapping his child across the face and dragging him out by his collar into the hallway. He then checked on the traumatized female teacher and resumed teaching as if nothing had happened. It's still quite strange, but after that day in high school gym class, a quiet nerdy kid kept getting picked on during dodgeball. One jerk kept hitting him with balls even after he was already out. The quiet kid wasn't small. He was about average in size, maybe a little taller than average. Eventually, he lost his temper, ran across the court, and literally gave the jerk a double-handed choke slam. Since we were all teenage boys, we stopped supporting him. He received a 3-day suspension, but it was reduced to 1 day in school after a number of us went to the principal and described the events in Story 9. You have to picture him as a gentle giant 6'9"-ish, with arms as thick as my thigh, but he just shrugged it off. His hobbies included taking care of shelter cats and writing reviews for strangely specific music theory books online. I eventually became friends with him, and we hung out occasionally, getting coffee and other things. Back in university, one guy understood how to greet people in small talk, but not much more was known as the literal rock against the waves childish freshmen picked on him for ages. We were engaged in a lively conversation one day when 3 of the childish freshmen approached and harassed him. He told them twice that we were in the middle of a conversation and that they didn't need to bother us. When they didn't succeed, he simply shrugged and tried to carry on the conversation. When one of them reached the breaking point, he revealed that his mother had died when he was 14 and that he had never completely come to terms with it. He took a deep breath, got up, and grabbed the offender by the head, swinging him like a club, kicking the others into next Tuesday when he immediately calmed down Story 10 after they were all on the ground before I and 2 other people could eventually remove him. As a man who rarely spoke and never hurried, the grandfather once got into a heated argument with my partner in which they slammed the back door at each other until they broke the window. They claimed that he was a steel worker who worked for a moving company on the weekends. The house was short but brick-like, and I don't remember what caused it. But I do remember my father making my grandmother cry and my grandfather charging in like a bull grabbing my. The first time I witnessed my grandfather lose his rage was when he was pitched across the house. My dad took the wise option to run away as soon as he woke up. Story 11. When my cousin and I were helping my grandfather with some work one day, we came across this story. There is a lot of poverty in my hometown, and one of the poorer families was at the store. My cousin made some remarks that made me realize that they were poor in what way. My grandfather is a nice, funny, flirty guy who worked in a manufacturing company after being the third employee. Everyone gets along with him, and he was fairly well off in my small town. The only time I have ever witnessed my grandfather acting aggressively was in Story 12, when he grabbed him and slammed him against a wall, saying, "Nothing in your life makes you better than them right now. I'd rather have them by me than you." My cousin then apologized, and my grandfather said, "My cousin will pay for whatever they're getting." My cousin now works off the expenses for him to prove a lesson. Currently, my cousin is a stand-up social worker specializing in poverty abuse and rehabilitation. 2 incidents come to mind where the judo champion of her school was one of the major perpetrators of bullying me. On one occasion, as we were climbing the stairs to our French class on the top floor, he grabbed me in a bear hug from behind and locked my arms to my side. My only option was to throw my head back and crack him on the bridge of my nose. On another occasion, he placed a thin plastic bag over my head, which I believe was ripped primarily by his attempt to force it onto my unwilling head. He stopped only after I pushed him into a corner of a table. The bear hug going up the stairs was one of his favorite tricks. He had spoken to teachers about him and others, but it was just blown off, I suppose, because the biggest bullies in my year were the majority of the prefects, with the head boy serving as the ringleader. In both cases, however, as it was their word against mine, this was the last time this happened. My uncle, who is the most tranquil guy I know, is basically a living example of what will occur if you combine General Iro Bob Ross and Dr. Dolittle. He maintains the garden, feeds wild birds out of the palm of his hand, and has been known to approach a deer without it fleeing. In my entire life, I have never heard him raise his voice except when speaking to someone very far away. He served in the military during Vietnam, but I'm not sure which branch, and he was the guy who fixed items returned from a combat zone. After the war, he carries on with his regular life, working at a tire factory. One night, after a difficult day at work, he goes to the local bar to get a drink. 3 men are standing outside chatting among themselves. He tries to enter, but they stop him. He tells them he doesn't want any trouble, that he's just had a stressful day at work, and that he wants to get a drink. They argue back and forth for a while, and finally he pushes past them to enter. They don't like that, so he pulls him back, where he floors another third, knocks one unconscious, and lets him in. By the time he leaves, they are gone from sight. Story 14. During the few years they shared a home, a gentleman I knew who had a serious anger management problem managed to keep it under control until one day he lost it. Some minor issue hit her repeatedly, banged her face against the concrete, and attempted to choke her until a bystander stopped him. The relationship ended. She was going to get her belongings from the apartment, but she also obviously didn't want to go alone, so 2 other friends and her brother, whom I also knew, accompanied her to keep things in check and to help Gary's belongings. When we got to X, her brother, who is normally very mild and docile, lost it and smacked the guy against the wall with one hand and punched him repeatedly, holding him against the wall the entire time because you don't hit. Someone was down, and we just stood there in shock and awe at how the girl looked after the beating. She had been beaten black and blue, and her entire face was scraped and had choke marks around her neck. We didn't really care about what was happening, so we just let him punch him out. Then we got her belongings and left, but he began to wake up twice in the months that followed. The axe was jumped twice outside in the evening. I'm not sure who did it, and I don't want to know. I suppose everyone has their trigger story 15. This one man from our school year, Greg versus Jimmy, was enormous. We'll say his name was Greg. He was 6 feet tall at the age of 15 and had a beard growing in a few years earlier. He was the nicest guy you'd ever met, and even after all these years, he is still a genuine model of a good person. However, throughout the year, he was being teased by this other boy, let's call him Jimmy, who had some issues with his self-esteem and used to constantly pick on younger children. It got interesting when Jimmy put aside his gentle boasting, knowing that he wouldn't retaliate. Jimmy was rarely in school, but he would still hang around the school gates with roughly 6 or 7 friends waiting for Greg to show up. The Baldwin they did, at last, one weekend when we were all out on the street drinking like everyone else, and Jimmy and company jumped Greg. Greg went crazy. A couple of Jimmy's pals held us back, while Greg knocked out 4 of the guys clean out before they brought him down. It was like watching the Hulk fight. Jimmy obviously ran for the fight, but at school the following Monday, he was back to his normal self again, or so it seemed. I wish I had seen the next part though. Greg struck Jimmy with an uppercut so hard that he was flung across a school desk and told to leave Education Justice Story 16. A father-in-law is a very patient man who is quiet, reserved, and has a great sense of humor when my mother-in-law gives him the opportunity to speak. In any case, my mother-in-law talks a lot and will ask you questions, and when you start to respond, she talks over you and tries to answer them herself. It's annoying and annoying. One time, she asked me a question, and I started to respond, but she interrupted me to essentially finish my response for her. Then she started to ask another question, repeating until my patience finally exploded on her, essentially screaming at her, "Oh my God, let your mother-in-law answer your question instead of interrupting you." It was so wonderful that they nearly tackled him to give him a hug, but she still does it. That day was incredible. Narrative 17. I've always known my dad, a career Army officer, to be a soft-spoken, never angry person who hardly ever raises his voice, as far as I'm aware, because of a statute in the USS that, in essence, prevents any service member approaching 20 years old from being compelled to leave, so that, when he receives a few days later, my dad received another call from his commanding general informing him that he would be forced to leave due to Army-wide budget cuts. He got up from his seat and began shouting at the general on the phone, telling him that it was impossible because of the law, because he was in the safe zone. He quoted section after section, telling the general that he had up and that it better be fixed. The general's first words were, "Before you say anything, let me apologize for the other day." The general was absolutely correct, and as soon as my dad turned 20, he was retired. Story 18. My dad didn't have a traditional office job, so he made his own schedule, which gave him a lot of flexibility. After running around the school, he was referred to a bureaucrat at the district offices, but this guy didn't want to meet my father, so even though he made an appointment, he wasn't there that day. Fun fact, that excuse doesn't work very well when you have designated parking spots. The appointment was at 2 p.m., so my dad blocked the car in, rolled down the windows, took out a book, and began. Around 7 p.m., he hears a man coughing to get attention without being overt. Oh, the bureaucrat has arrived at the office and is prepared for his meeting at 2 p.m. Story 19. Even now, 40 years later, I think my father, who had a legendary temper and never lost it in front of me, was sued for malpractice by this insane patient who was the quintessential ambulance-chasing lawyer. We were in the car when we saw the lawyer, and my father said calmly but furiously, "If you weren't in this car, I'd crash right into that piece of," would have carried out the terrifying story 20. There were about 10 of us living across the street from the elementary school, and since I was not in school, I would frequently sit on the front porch with a book and watch the kids across the street. One day, I heard Matthew's voice start to spin up, and when I looked up, I saw that he was facing down a kid in the face only a step away. My little brothers are fraternal twins, and Matthew is emotional, high-strung, and always gets himself into trouble because he can't keep his mouth shut. Philip is the complete opposite, calm, rational, and quiet. I'm furious, and a tiny part of me is laughing because holy, the one was new, but before I can say anything, Philip comes with a flying pawn straight to the side of the kid's head and knocks him right on his head. Matthew is shocked out of his tears when his antagonizer says, "Your birth certificate was an apology letter from the abortion clinic." I have just stepped onto the grass across the street. "I'm kind of proud of you, Jude." I tell Philip that he's sticking out for your brother. Philip gives me the flattest look I've ever seen on a child. Even though I wasn't protecting him, he says that's my birth certificate too, story 21. The old performs an incredibly beautiful airborne sucker punch. Philip stands over the kid, practically snarling until I make it up to them. The kid sees Philip as distracted by me walking up and takes off. My normally understanding, obedient, and compassionate stepfather has shown his wrath twice in the last 20 years. The first occasion was when some 12th graders chased my brother and, in a calm, teeth-biting manner, stepdad Conley walked to the backyard and grabbed the big kids by the throats and lifted them, pinning them to the fence and saying, "Stay the hell away from my kids." The kids booked it faster than I've ever seen anyone run, and no one ever bothered my brother or cousin again. Then we all went inside and made hamburgers. The second time was during my angsty preteen years when I called my mother and it turned to me. This time, I had never been so terrified in my life. The moment he backed off a little, he bucked it into my bedroom and barricaded myself in with everything I could find. I remained there for a full day until I plucked up the courage to apologize, but he's a teddy bear normally, story 22. I backed up against a bar counter, protecting myself with the legs of the bar stool. When I was in high school, my dad lived on a hill approximately 10 years ago. If you go down the hill, you'll enter the main part of town, which has all the stores and other things, and if you go up the other side, you'll find many pubs and clubs. It's obviously faster to go over than around, but then my mom's car was being damaged by drunk idiots, and one night when Dad had a day off on the weekend, he heard a group of drunk people walking up the road. Since his little office or computer room is at the very front of the house, he got up, went out the front door, and just waited near the front lawn, watching you being loud and pushing each other around. Mom is worried because she doesn't want him to get hurt by some drunk idiot, so she comes to get me. I go out to see what he's doing, and they end up pushing each other around more in one bump into the. Dad tells him to leave the car or is leaning on it in the hood of the car, and they begin to taunt him. He approaches them, and one of the little jerks cleanly smashes the side mirror off while laughing at him. On a typical day, Dad hits him in the jaw, and you can see his jaw completely broken. The guys immediately scream and cry all at once, and his friends pick him up and flee. He never hears from them again, and he gets in trouble for it. Let's remove the mirror from the 6A. His vehicle seems like a smart choice.